On the morning of October 7, 1918, a blindfolded American soldier stumbled through the mist of the Argonne Forest, a white flag clutched in his trembling hands. Behind him, in shallow foxholes scraped into a muddy hillside, fewer than 200 starving men watched him approach. They had been without food for 4 days, without clean water for 3. Their own artillery had shelled them. German flamethrowers had tried to burn them alive, and now the enemy was asking them to surrender. What happened in the ravine over those 6 desperate days would become one of the most celebrated episodes in American military history. But the story of the Lost Battalion is not simply a tale of courage under fire. It is the story of how 554 immigrant soldiers from the streets of New York City became trapped behind enemy lines in the deadliest battle their country had ever fought, and how their refusal to break would cost them everything, including the man who led them. The autumn of 1918 found the world exhausted by 4 years of industrial slaughter. Along the Western Front, millions of men had died fighting over the same scarred miles of French countryside since 1914. But in the final months of the war, the arrival of fresh American forces tipped the balance. The German army, bled white by years of attrition, could no longer replace its losses. The Allies sensed that victory was finally within reach. On September 26th, the American Expeditionary Force launched the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest military operation in United States history. More than 1,200,000 American soldiers would eventually participate in the campaign, supported by 800,000 French troops. Their objective was ambitious: break through 40 miles of fortified German defenses and capture the railroad junction at Sedan. Nearly every supply train feeding the German armies in France passed through that junction. Its capture would sever the enemy's logistical lifeline and force Germany to its knees. But the path to Sedan ran directly through the Argonne Forest, and the Argonne was a fortress. The Germans had held this ground since the opening weeks of the war. 4 years of continuous occupation had transformed the forest into a labyrinth of concrete bunkers, interlocking trenches, and carefully positioned machine gun nests. Barbed wire lay coiled beneath the undergrowth like sleeping serpents. Artillery observers perched on the high ground could call down fire on any movement below. The terrain itself conspired against attackers. Steep ravines, dense vegetation, and rocky outcroppings broke up formations and swallowed units whole. Men who wandered off the narrow paths simply disappeared. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, understood that taking the Argonne would be costly. But he also understood that the war was entering its final chapter. The German army was weakening by the day, and Pershing believed that one decisive blow could end the fighting before winter. His orders to the divisions attacking into the forest reflected this urgency. Advance without regard of losses. Advance without regard to the exposed conditions of the flanks. The message was clear: the offensive would not stop for anything. For the officers and men ordered into that forest, the implications were equally clear. There would be no retreat. Any soldier who called for withdrawal was to be treated as a traitor and shot on the spot. Among the divisions tasked with breaking through the Argonne was the 77th Infantry Division, and no unit in the American Army looked quite like it. Known officially as the Statue of Liberty Division for the patch its soldiers wore, the 77th had earned another nickname that better captured its character. They called it the Melting Pot Division, and the name was no exaggeration. The division had been raised almost entirely from the streets of New York City. Its ranks were filled with draftees from the tenements of the Lower East Side, the walk-ups of Brooklyn, and the crowded neighborhoods of the Bronx. They spoke 42 different languages and dialects. Nearly 1/4 of the division was Jewish, many of them recent immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe. The rest came from every corner of the world: Italians, Irish, Poles, Greeks, Russians, Chinese, Germans, and native-born Americans fought side by side in the same companies. Their backgrounds were as varied as their nationalities. The division's ranks included street toughs and urchins, bartenders and grocers, cops and streetcar conductors. There were writers and baseball players, stockbrokers and drifters, blue bloods and men who had grown up fighting for scraps. The regular Army officers assigned to train them at Camp Upton on Long Island were not impressed. One observer described the first arrivals as a motley crew, divided into two large classes, the man of muscle and the man of brain. From the variety of languages spoken, he wrote, one might have imagined himself at the Tower of Babel. By October 1918, the 77th Division had already seen hard fighting on the Western Front. The summer's campaigns had taken a heavy toll. Battalions that should have numbered 800 men now counted barely half that strength. Many of the experienced soldiers who had trained together at Camp Upton were dead or wounded, replaced by raw draftees from the Midwest who had received only minimal instruction. Some of these replacements had never fired a rifle in training. One was found smoking behind a bush during a battle, unable to figure out how to load his weapon. These were the men who would be asked to break through the most heavily fortified sector of the German line. And leading them into the Argonne were two officers who could not have been more different. Major Charles Whittlesey stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with spectacles and a scholarly bearing that earned him the nickname Count among his classmates at Williams College. Born in Florence, Wisconsin in 1884, Whittlesey had grown up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the son of a logger turned businessman. He graduated third brightest in his class at Williams, earned his law degree from Harvard, and built a successful practice on Wall Street. He was bookish, sensitive, intellectual. As a young man, he had briefly joined the American Socialist Party before resigning in disgust over what he viewed as the movement's increasing extremism. He was, by every measure, an unlikely warrior. But when America entered the war in April 1917, Whittlesey took a leave from his law firm and volunteered for the Army. He shipped to France as a captain in the 308th Infantry Regiment and was promoted to major by September. Now he commanded the regiment's 1st Battalion, responsible for several hundred men whose languages he could barely understand and whose backgrounds could not have been more different from his own. His counterpart in the 2nd Battalion was Captain George McMurtry, and where Whittlesey was an intellectual, McMurtry was a fighter. Also a Harvard graduate and a Wall Street lawyer, McMurtry had one credential that set him apart from most officers in the division. 20 years earlier, he had ridden with Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders at the Battle of San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. He knew what combat looked like. He was also, by all accounts, the most well-liked officer in the entire regiment. The men trusted him. On October 1st, 1918, Whittlesey and McMurtry received their orders. They were to advance north through the ravine d'Argonne until they reached the Charlevoix Mill, then secure the road beyond it. French forces would protect their left flank. American units from the 92nd Division would cover their right. The attack would begin at dawn the following day. Both officers recognized immediately that the mission was nearly impossible. Their two battalions together could barely muster 800 men, less than half their combined authorized strength. They would be attacking into terrain the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying, with no guarantee that their flanks would actually be protected. Whittlesey and McMurtry protested to their regimental commander. The task was too much for two understrength battalions. They were overruled. The offensive would proceed as planned. Advance regardless of losses. Advance regardless of exposed flanks. Whittlesey accepted the order with a response that would prove prophetic. "All right," he said, "I will attack, but whether you will hear from me again, I do not know." At 5 o'clock on the morning of October 2nd, the final orders arrived. Whittlesey assembled his company commanders in the gray light before dawn. The weather was cold but clear. He handed them their instructions and spoke the words that would send 554 men into the forest. "Everybody ready? Let us go." Forward. The two battalions moved out into the Argonne, climbing through the tangled undergrowth toward their objective. Somewhere ahead, the Germans waited, and behind them, unknown to Whittlesey or any of his men, the forces that should have protected their flanks were already falling back. The trap was set. The Lost Battalion was walking straight into it. The morning of October 2nd began with unexpected success. As Whittlesey's battalions pushed north through the forest, they encountered German resistance, but not the impenetrable wall they had feared. Machine gun nests opened fire from concealed positions, and men fell, but the Americans pressed forward. They found seams in the German defenses, gaps that had been left undermanned as the enemy repositioned its forces. By midday, the lead companies had overrun Hill 198 and were descending into the Charlevoix ravine beyond. By evening, Whittlesey had achieved what his commanders demanded. His men occupied the high ground north of the Charlevoix mill, exactly where their orders said they should be. The road they had been sent to capture lay below them. Whittlesey dispatched a runner back through the forest to report their position and request reinforcements. The message was clear. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 308th Infantry had broken through. What Whittlesey did not know, what he could not have known, was that his success had become a catastrophe. On his left flank, the French forces that were supposed to advance alongside him had been stopped cold. German machine guns had pinned them down within hours of the attack's start, and they had made no progress. On his right, the American 92nd Division had fared no better. Fierce counterattacks had driven them back to their original positions. Whittlesey's battalions had punched through the German line, but they had punched through alone. The units that should have protected their flanks were now miles behind them, and the gap they had created was already closing. That night, as Whittlesey's men dug foxholes into the hillside and tried to rest, German commanders realized what had happened. A small American force had pushed far beyond the main line, isolated and unsupported. The opportunity was obvious. Throughout the darkness, German units from across the Argonne sector rushed toward the Charlevoix ravine. By dawn on October 3rd, they'd completed the encirclement. The Lost Battalion was trapped. The first sign of trouble came when Whittlesey's runners failed to return. He had sent several men back through the forest to request supplies and reinforcements, but none of them reached headquarters. Some were killed by German patrols. Others were captured. A few simply vanished into the undergrowth, never to be seen again. Telephone lines were impossible in the dense forest, the wires too easily cut or tangled. Whittlesey's only reliable means of communication were the 8 carrier pigeons his men had brought with them. There was one piece of good news. Captain Nelson Holderman and his Company K from the 307th Infantry had managed to break through the German encirclement and reach Whittlesey's position. The arrival of 97 additional men was welcome, though it did little to change the mathematics of their situation. Whittlesey now commanded roughly 550 soldiers, dug into an oval perimeter perhaps 300 yards long and 60 yards wide. They had one day's rations remaining. Their ammunition was limited to what the men carried on their backs, and they were surrounded by a German force that grew larger by the hour. Holderman himself was a welcome addition to the command group. A California National Guard officer, he had a reputation as a soldier's soldier who never turned down a patrol and approached combat as an adventure. He would need every ounce of that spirit in the days ahead. Whittlesey assigned him to command the right flank of the pocket, the sector most exposed to German attack. The first assaults came on October 3rd. German infantry probed the American perimeter, testing for weak points. Grenades arced through the trees and exploded among the foxholes. Machine guns swept the slopes. Whittlesey's men fired back with everything they had, but every bullet expended was a bullet they could not replace. By nightfall, the casualty count was climbing, and no relief was in sight. October 4th brought horror from an unexpected direction. At 2:45 in the afternoon, American artillery shells began falling on the Lost Battalion's position. The coordinates that had been relayed back to headquarters were wrong, whether through miscommunication or simple error, and now Whittlesey's own countrymen were killing his men. The barrage lasted nearly 90 minutes. High explosive rounds detonated among the foxholes, shredding men who had survived everything the Germans could throw at them. There was no cover adequate against artillery. The men could only press themselves into the mud and pray. Whittlesey scrambled to stop the bombardment. He released one of his precious carrier pigeons with a message correcting the coordinates, but the bird was shot down almost immediately by German riflemen who had learned to watch for the distinctive flutter of wings. A second pigeon met the same fate. The shells kept falling. By now, approximately 30 men had been killed or wounded by friendly fire, and Whittlesey was down to his last bird. Her name was Cher Ami, French for dear friend, a black Czech homing pigeon donated to the American Army by British pigeon fanciers earlier that year. Whittlesey scrawled a desperate message on a scrap of paper. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." A soldier named Omer Richards attached the message to Cher Ami's leg and released her into the sky. The Germans saw her rise and opened fire. A bullet tore through her breast. Another nearly severed her right leg, leaving the message capsule dangling by a single tendon. Whittlesey's men watched in despair as the bird tumbled toward the ground. Then, against all odds, Cher Ami began to fly again. Wounded, bleeding, half-blinded, the pigeon climbed above the trees and turned south toward the American lines. She covered 25 miles in approximately 25 minutes, arriving at her loft with the message still attached to what remained of her shattered leg. By the time she landed, the artillery barrage had already stopped, but her flight had confirmed exactly where Whittlesey's men were trapped. That information would prove critical in the days ahead. Cher Ami survived her wounds, though Army medics had to amputate her leg. The French government would later award her the Croix de Guerre for gallantry. She became one of the most celebrated animals in American military history. But on the afternoon of October 4th, she was simply the last hope of 500 desperate men, and she had not let them down. The siege ground on. October 5th brought more attacks and more casualties. The food was gone now. Water could only be obtained by crawling under fire to a small stream at the bottom of the ravine, and German snipers had zeroed in on the approaches. Men died with canteens in their hands, shot through the head as they tried to fill them. The wounded lay in rows, their bandages unchanged, their moans carrying through the trees. There was no morphine left. There was almost nothing left. Captain McMurtry was shot through the knee, the bullet shattering his kneecap. He refused evacuation and continued to command from a stretcher, then from a foxhole, then by crawling from position to position through the mud. His signature phrase echoed through the pocket at all hours. "Everything is practically okay," he would whisper to exhausted men. "Everything is practically okay." Captain Holderman was wounded on October 4th, then again on October 5th, then again on October 7th. He never stopped fighting. By the 6th day, he was commanding his sector while propped up on 2 rifles used as makeshift crutches, unable to walk but unwilling to yield. The morning of October 6th brought a new terror. German commanders, frustrated by the Americans' refusal to break, sent in their elite stormtroopers reinforced with a weapon that many of Whittlesey's men had never seen. The flamethrowers, flamethrowers. Jets of burning fuel arced through the forest, reaching 100 feet from the nozzles. Men screamed and fled as fire consumed the underbrush around them. Some of the Americans broke, scrambling back from the wall of flame in blind panic. For a moment, it seemed the line would collapse. Then Holderman, balanced on his rifle crutches, began shouting orders. The last operational Hotchkiss machine gun in the pocket swung toward the flamethrower teams. The gunner opened fire, and the operators went down, some of them igniting in their own spilled fuel. The attack faltered. The Americans held. The assault lasted more than 2 hours. When it was over, the pocket had shrunk, more men were dead, and the casualty rate had climbed to nearly 70%, but the line still held. That night, as darkness fell over the ravine, Whittlesey took stock of what remained. Fewer than 200 effective men, almost no ammunition, no food, no water, no medicine. The Germans were massing for another assault. And somewhere beyond the forest, American headquarters still did not know if they were alive or dead. The Lost Battalion had survived another day, but October 7th would bring a choice that would define everything that came after. Dawn on October 7th found the survivors of the Lost Battalion in a state beyond exhaustion. They had not eaten in 4 days. Most had not slept in 3. The wounded filled every available space, their untreated injuries festering in the cold autumn air. Ammunition had been rationed to a handful of rounds per man. Some soldiers had resorted to throwing rocks at German patrols, having nothing else left to throw. The dead lay where they had fallen, there being neither the strength nor the safety to bury them. In the gray light before sunrise, 9 enlisted men made a desperate decision. American aircraft had been attempting to drop supplies to the pocket, but every package had fallen outside the perimeter, landing in German-held territory. The men had watched food and medicine drift down through the trees, tantalizingly close but impossibly out of reach. Now, driven beyond caution by hunger, the 9 soldiers slipped out of the American lines to search for one of the fallen packages. They found Germans instead. 5 of the 9 were killed in the ambush. The other 4, all wounded, were taken prisoner. Among them was Private Lowell Hollingshead, a young soldier who had proven himself repeatedly during the siege. The Germans recognized an opportunity. Rather than simply interrogating their captives, they decided to use one of them as a messenger. Later that morning, the American sentries spotted movement in the forest. A figure was approaching the perimeter, walking slowly, a white cloth tied to a stick held above his head. As he drew closer, they recognized the uniform. It was Hollingshead, blindfolded, stumbling forward with his hands raised. In his pocket was a letter. The message was brought to Whittlesey, who read it with McMurtry and Holderman looking on. The letter was written in English, its tone unexpectedly formal and even respectful. The German commander acknowledged the courage of the American defense. He noted that the suffering of the wounded could be heard across the lines. He appealed to Whittlesey's humanitarian instincts, urging him to consider the lives of his remaining men. The letter closed with a remarkable statement about the messenger himself. "Please treat Private Lowell Hollingshead as an honorable man," it read. "He is quite a soldier. We envy you." The message was not a demand, it was an invitation. Surrender, and the killing would stop. Refuse, and the Germans would resume their assault with everything they had. For a long moment, Whittlesey said nothing. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Fewer than 200 men remained capable of fighting. They were out of food, nearly out of ammunition, and completely surrounded. No relief had come. No relief might ever come. Surrender would save the lives of everyone still breathing in that ravine. The German letter even promised honorable treatment. By any rational calculation, capitulation was the only sensible choice. But Whittlesey had not been sent into the Argonne to make sensible choices. He had been sent to take and hold this ground, and he had taken it. The order from headquarters still stood: no retreat, no surrender. Later, newspapers would report that Whittlesey had responded to the German offer with a defiant shout. "Go to hell," the stories claimed he had yelled, his words echoing through the forest. It made for a perfect headline, the kind of quote that transforms a soldier into a legend. There was only one problem: it never happened. Whittlesey himself would later deny ever saying it. When asked about the incident after the war, he explained that no reply to the demand to surrender seemed necessary. He had simply ignored the letter, treating it with the silent contempt it deserved. The truth was more dignified than the myth, if less dramatic. Whittlesey did not waste breath on curses. He had work to do. His first order was practical. Throughout the siege, the Americans had laid out white cloth panels to mark their position for Allied aircraft attempting supply drops. Now, Whittlesey commanded that every piece of white fabric be pulled in and hidden. He would give the Germans no indication of surrender, not even an accidental one. His second order was to prepare for the assault that would surely follow. The men checked their weapons, counted their remaining rounds, and waited. The attack came within the hour. German infantry advanced from multiple directions, supported by mortars and machine guns. The fighting was close and brutal. The ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Americans fired until their rifles were empty, then fought with bayonets and fists. The line bent, but did not break. As the assault raged, Whittlesey made one final attempt to bring help. He called for volunteers to slip through the German lines and make contact with American forces. Several men had already tried and failed, their bodies lying somewhere in the forest between the pocket and safety. But one more soldier stepped forward. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky was an unlikely hero. A Jewish immigrant from Poland, he had come to America in 1912 specifically to escape military service in the Russian army. "I hated Russia," he would later write, "its people, its government, in particular its cruel and inhuman treatment of Jews. Such a government I refused to serve." He had found work as a barber in the Bronx, a quiet life, far removed from the violence of the old world. Then, America entered the war, and Krotoshinsky was drafted into the army he had once fled across an ocean to avoid. Now he was volunteering for a mission that amounted to suicide. The German lines were thick with patrols. Every previous runner had been killed or captured. Krotoshinsky spoke with an accent that could easily be mistaken for German. If he was captured, he would likely be shot as a spy. He went anyway. Krotoshinsky left the pocket at daybreak and immediately came under fire. He sprinted across open ground, dove into underbrush, crawled through mud. For hours, he worked his way south, moving inches at a time when German patrols passed nearby. At one point, he lay motionless in a shallow depression, playing dead, while a German soldier walked directly over him. The man's boot came down on Krotoshinsky's finger, grinding it into the dirt. Krotoshinsky did not make a sound. By late afternoon, he had penetrated the German encirclement, but his ordeal was not over. He was approaching from enemy territory, wearing a mud-caked uniform that was barely recognizable, speaking English with a heavy Polish accent. When he finally spotted American soldiers, he faced a new danger. They might shoot him before he could explain who he was. Krotoshinsky began shouting the only word he was certain the Germans never used. "Hello," he called out, again and again. "Hello, hello." The Americans held their fire. A patrol crept forward to investigate. When they realized what they had found, they rushed him to headquarters. The message Krotoshinsky carried was simple. The Lost Battalion was still alive, their position was confirmed, and they desperately needed relief. The American response was immediate. Fresh troops from the 307th Infantry began pushing toward the pocket. At the same time, far to the north, the 82nd Division had finally broken through the German line, threatening to encircle the very forces that had surrounded Whittlesey. The Germans, facing the prospect of being trapped themselves, began to withdraw. On the evening of October 7th, the first relief troops reached the Charlevoix ravine. The siege was over. The men who walked out of the pocket the following morning barely resembled soldiers. They were filthy, starving, hollow-eyed. Many had to be carried. The stretcher-bearers worked for hours, evacuating the wounded down trails still littered with the dead. When the final count was made, the numbers told the story of what those 6 days had cost. Of the 554 men who had entered the Argonne on October 2nd, 107 were dead, 190 were wounded. 63 were missing, most of them almost certainly killed, their bodies never recovered from the forest. Only 194 walked out under their own power, and of those, only a handful were deemed fit to continue the advance. The casualty rate approached 70%. It was one of the most costly small unit actions in American military history. Whittlesey was promoted to lieutenant colonel on the spot. McMurtry and Holderman would join him in receiving the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. Krotoshinsky received the Distinguished Service Cross for his mission through the German lines. In all, 7 Medals of Honor would be awarded for actions connected to the Lost Battalion, more than any single American combat episode until the Ploesti oil refinery raid in the Second World War. The name itself would endure as one of the great stories of the First World War, though those who had lived it knew the name was wrong. The Lost Battalion had never been lost. They had known exactly where they were the entire time. One veteran put it best in the blunt language of a soldier. "Hell, we were not lost," he said. "The Germans knew where we were the whole time. They had simply refused to leave." Charles Whittlesey returned to the United States a hero. The story of the Lost Battalion had captured the imagination of a nation hungry for tales of American valor, and Whittlesey was its central figure. On December 6, 1918, he stood on Boston Common while Major General Clarence Edwards pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest, one of the first 3 awarded for the war. Captain McMurtry received his medal the same day. Captain Holderman would receive his shortly after. The men who had held the Charlevoix Ravine were now officially among the most celebrated soldiers in American history. The accolades continued. In 1919, Whittlesey appeared in a silent film about the siege, playing himself alongside many of the actual survivors. The movie drew enormous crowds. When the 77th Division paraded through New York City in May of that year, thousands lined the streets to cheer the men of the Melting Pot Division. The immigrant soldiers who had been dismissed as a motley crew just 2 years earlier were now symbols of American courage and unity. They had proven that bravery had no nationality, that the sons of 42 nations could stand together as one. For Abraham Krotoshinsky, the recognition was particularly meaningful. The Polish-Jewish barber who had fled Russian military service was now an American hero, his photograph in newspapers across the country. General Pershing personally presented him with the Distinguished Service Cross, praising his extraordinary heroism in slipping through enemy lines. Krotoshinsky became a naturalized citizen and, inspired by Zionist ideals, eventually emigrated to Palestine to try his hand at farming. When that venture failed, he returned to New York, where he struggled to make ends meet until Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia, the future mayor, read about his plight and lobbied President Calvin Coolidge to give the war hero a job. Coolidge signed an executive order appointing Krotoshinsky to a position with the Postal Service, where he worked until his death in 1953. Cher Ami, the pigeon who had carried the desperate message through German fire, became a celebrity in her own right. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre with palm for gallantry. Army medics fitted her with a tiny wooden leg to replace the one that had been shot away. When she died in June 1919, her body was preserved and donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where she remains on display to this day. In 2021, more than a century after her famous flight, DNA testing finally confirmed what Army records had long disputed. Cher Ami was male. But for Charles Whittlesey, the homecoming was not a triumph. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling. He tried to resume his old life. He returned to his law practice at the prestigious Wall Street firm of White & Case, hoping to pick up where he had left off before the war. But the war would not leave him. The story of the Lost Battalion had made Whittlesey famous, and fame brought demands he could not escape. Requests for speeches poured in. Invitations to parades, ceremonies, and banquets filled his calendar. Universities offered honorary degrees. Newspapers sought interviews. Everyone wanted a piece of the hero of the Argonne. Whittlesey accepted these obligations with the same sense of duty that had carried him through the forest. He spoke at events across the country, though he never discussed his own experiences. When he addressed audiences, he talked only about his men, the ordinary soldiers who had held the line. He deflected every attempt to celebrate his personal courage. The praise that others heaped upon him seemed to cause him physical discomfort. In private, the burden was crushing him. "Not a day goes by," he confided to a friend, "but I hear from some of my old outfit, usually about some sorrow or misfortune. I cannot bear it much more." The letters arrived constantly. Wounded veterans wrote asking for help finding work. Widows wrote seeking assistance with pensions. Families wrote with news of sons and husbands who had never recovered from what they had seen in the forest. Whittlesey answered every letter. He visited the wounded in hospitals across New York. He attended funerals, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, standing graveside as men he had led were lowered into the earth. He served as chairman of the Red Cross roll call, throwing himself into work on behalf of veterans, even as his own health deteriorated. On at least one occasion, he left his sickbed to attend the funeral of an enlisted man who had served under him. The public saw a hero. Those closest to Whittlesey saw something else. He had grown gaunt and withdrawn. He refused to speak about his personal experiences in the Argonne, even to friends and family. The bookish lawyer, who had once debated politics with vigor, now sat silent at gatherings, his mind clearly somewhere far away. He never married. He had no children. The war had hollowed him out, and nothing seemed capable of filling the void. What Whittlesey suffered from had no name in 1918. Doctors called it shell shock, a term that suggested the problem was purely physical, a matter of nerves rattled by artillery concussions. Today, we would recognize it as post-traumatic stress disorder. The invisible wound that afflicts soldiers who survive experiences too terrible for the mind to process. Whittlesey had watched men die under his command for 6 consecutive days. He had ordered them to hold a position that cost them 70% casualties. He had refused a surrender that might have saved lives. And now, every letter from a grieving family, every funeral he attended, every nightmare that jolted him awake in the darkness, reminded him of the price his decisions had exacted. The criticism made it worse. Despite his military vindication, some newspapers questioned whether Whittlesey should have surrendered to spare his men further suffering. The accusations were unfounded. He had followed orders, he had done his duty. But the doubts gnawed at him nonetheless. On November 11, 1921, exactly 3 years after the armistice, Whittlesey traveled to Arlington National Cemetery for a ceremony unlike any the nation had seen. The body of an unknown American soldier, recovered from a French battlefield, was to be interred in a place of honor as a symbol of all those who had given their lives in the war. President Warren Harding presided. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, attended. Thousands of wounded veterans, many missing limbs, filled the crowds. Whittlesey had been selected as one of 6 pallbearers, all of them Medal of Honor recipients. He walked beside Alvin York and Samuel Woodfill, men whose names had become synonymous with American heroism. Together, they carried the flag-draped casket to its final resting place. Afterward, Whittlesey spoke to McMurtry, his old comrade from the pocket. "I should have never come here," he said. "The whole time I kept thinking it was one of my men." Friends who saw him that day described a man who seemed drawn and ill at ease, surrounded by reminders of everything he had lost. The unknown soldier could have been any of the 107 men who had died in the Charlevoix ravine. In Whittlesey's mind, perhaps he was all of them. 13 days later, on November 24th, Whittlesey booked passage from New York to Havana aboard the SS Toloa, a steamship operated by the United Fruit Company. He told no one of his plans. Not his family, not his friends, not his law partners. Before leaving, he visited his office and put his affairs in order. He prepared a will, leaving his property to his mother. He wrote 9 letters, addressed to his parents, his brothers, his uncle, and his closest friends, including McMurtry. To McMurtry, he left something else, the original German letter demanding the surrender of the Lost Battalion, the document he had kept for 3 years. On the evening of November 26th, the first night out from New York, Whittlesey dined with the ship's captain. Other passengers noted that he seemed relaxed, even cheerful. For the first time in years, he opened up about his experiences in the war, sharing stories and laughing with fellow travelers in the cocktail lounge. At 11:15, he excused himself and said he was retiring to his cabin. Charles Whittlesey was never seen again. The ship's crew searched for hours. They found his cabin undisturbed, the 9 letters neatly arranged, a note to the captain with instructions for disposing of his belongings. His body was never recovered from the Atlantic. One of the letters, addressed to his friend and former law partner John Bayard Pruin, was later made available to historians. It was brief. "Just a note to say goodbye," Whittlesey had written. "I am a misfit by nature and by training, and there is an end of it." The memorial service in Pittsfield drew 3,000 mourners. Colonel Nathan Averill, who had commanded the 308th Infantry, delivered the eulogy. His death, Averill said, was in reality a battle casualty, and he met his end as much in the line of duty as if he had fallen by a German bullet. A cenotaph stands in Pittsfield Cemetery today, marking the place where Charles Whittlesey would have been buried if his body had ever been found. The inscription notes simply that he was lost at sea. The hero of the Lost Battalion had become lost himself, claimed at last by the war he had survived but never escaped. The Argonne Forest stands quiet today. The ravine where 554 men held against impossible odds has been reclaimed by trees and undergrowth. Markers indicate where the pocket once was, but the forest keeps its secrets. The shell craters have softened into shallow depressions. The foxholes have filled with decades of fallen leaves. The war ended 5 weeks after the Lost Battalion walked out of those woods. The stand at Charlevoix helped break the German line and hastened the armistice that silenced the guns of the Great War. The immigrant soldiers of the Melting Pot Division had proven what Americans could accomplish when they stood together, regardless of where they were born or what language they spoke at home. Charles Whittlesey believed he was a misfit. He was wrong. He was exactly the leader his men needed, a quiet intellectual who found within himself a courage he never knew he possessed. The tragedy is not that he doubted himself. The tragedy is that he could not see what everyone else saw so clearly. The Lost Battalion was never lost. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. And their commander, for all his private suffering, had brought them through.